Echoes between stars. When a town learns to listen, its voice changes in ways no one can quite predict. Sound that once lived only in the bones of houses and the hollows of boats stretches farther. It catches on weather and on the thin air between roofs and becomes something like signal. In the years after the river taught them how to give enough that they remained, the people found that their small habits made an unexpected noise, not loud, but steady, and that this noise traveled. It began with letters, not the official kind bound in ribbons and stamped for bureaucracy, but the ragged, grateful letters merchants tucked into parcels, the short notes ferrymen left in the pockets of coats, the careful lists midwives wrote and passed to neighboring towns. A seed of method is dangerous and generous in equal measure. Once it is practiced, someone will always imagine that it can be taught a little farther and a little wider. Traders sent news of other harbors that cupped their own embers. Schoolmasters wrote from cities where a bell had been rung before meetings to remind people to listen. Each scrap of paper read aloud at the key sounded like a star blinking back across a winter sky. The town received these missives with the modest pride of gardeners who find that a cuttings has rooted. Prometheus single quotes S name, once a point of argument and then of ritual, began to travel with a different weight. In some letters he was a myth, in others an inconvenient man. In a long, elegant note from a coastal archive he appeared as a teacher who had shown a village a way to live without breaking itself. In a sailor's scrawl he was a nuisance who had made people soft. The penmanship argued that giving was a liability when storms came. The town kept all such letters in a box beneath the key. Unremarkable paper for the most remarkable evidence that habits reach outward like current. Beyond the letters came human bodies, envoys who sat on benches and ate bread, then left with knots and whistles wrapped into their packs. A wandering astronomer arrived one autumn, bent with travel and curious about the town that made a cairn of tools instead of relics. He brought a spyglass and a map of the heavens. He had been listening for a different kind of echo. We look up and we call what we see home, he said at the key, setting his brass instrument on the table like an offering. But often the stars are only the place we practice wishing. I wanted to see how you practice giving. People laughed at the notion that their small municipal habits might have cosmic relevance, but the astronomer stayed. He taught the children how to find certain slow-moving lights that the sailors called whales. He showed them how the same patience that steadied or steadied a telescope. On clear nights, he invited anyone willing to wait to watch the sky. They saw things they did not understand, blinking, distant, patient, then realized those twinkles behaved like the town itself. Some repeated patterns, some shifted and never returned. The town's quiet rituals, learned by muscle and eye, translated into a tenderness for the kind of time needed to trace a star's slow path. Watching the heavens became an exercise in attention. From the key's small observatory, they learned another lesson: echoes are not one way. A whisper flung out tonight may return years later in a voice shaped by other hands. The astronomer mapped a simple truth for them: that light travels, but it also records. It carries the names of storms and the shape of seas. It keeps the memory of a town's small gestures. When a child in a far harbor cupped a bowl of water because a teacher in this town had taught her father to do so, that act was a reflected beam. The stars were not messages from gods but mirrors for human habits. Not all echoes were kind. News reached the town of places where the practice of giving had been turned into a commodity, listenings sold by the hour, charity firms that patented small mercies with legal language. Prometheus's ember had been folded into business models. Instead of teaching how to cup an empty hand, some had learned how to package the illusion of empathy. The town received those reports with a steady, practical grief. It became an argument, again not of myth but of method. They spoke of safeguards, apprenticeship that could not be bought, rituals that required presence rather than a coin, public spaces where practice could not be privatized. Habit, they decided, should be hard enough to pass on freely but awkward enough to resist being turned into spectacle. Other echoes were sweeter. A teacher in a distant village sent a songbook with a lullaby that began with a whisper and a breath, a way of teaching patience to small throats. A ferryman out of town returned a reed whistle he had borrowed years ago with a note that said, simply, "It taught my son to wait." These small returns arrived like meteorites of goodness, unexpected, precise, and real. The town learned to watch for them with the same modest hunger they had for letters. Stars, learned the astronomer, are patient because their time is long. People, on the other hand, are impatient by temperament. They wanted answers earlier than the sky could give them. The town found its way in between. It practiced the long attention of the heavens in short acts: store a loaf for a neighbor, leave a door unlatched, make a knot that will hold. These scaled acts of patience became the town's telescope, a way to see farther than their own lives, a way to register echoes between otherwise distant lives. On one night when the moon was a thin wire and the key smelled of fish and new bread, a child climbed the cairn and glanced up. The stars seemed, for a while, to listen back. She thought of Prometheus cupping the river and of Mela's reed whistles and of the astronomer's brass. Something like a chord vibrated between those things. Fire taught them how to carry heat. Water taught them how to hold without clenching. Sky taught them to wait. The town's practices were not answers so much as an apparatus for receiving echoes, an infrastructure of attention. Years passed, and the box beneath the key grew full of letters and odd instruments: a distant town's map, a whistle, a catalogue of seeds, and a scrap of a ship's sail with a child's drawing of a cairn. The town read them aloud on Sundays, not as proclamations but as reminders that what they did had consequences beyond the bend. Children were apprenticed not only to potters and ferrymen but to keeping the list of correspondence, an ordinary task that taught patience. They learned to measure the slow accumulation of effect, a ledger of gentleness. Prometheus, wherever he might have been in stories, in memory, in the quiet places beyond the key, remained a figure of divided opinion. Some called him an initiator. Others named him a hazard. The town no longer needed unanimity. What mattered was practice. Whether he stole an ember or ferried a note, the thing set in motion had acquired a life of its own. It had become a habit capable of echoing like starlight, thin, persistent, and capable of changing a distant shore. At the close of the chapter, the town built a small, awkward device near the cairn, a wooden frame into which people could slide their letters and tokens, a place where echoes were formalized into a kind of archive. It was less a monument than a postbox for stars, a place to send out small, measured acts with the hope never guaranteed that somewhere, someone would catch them and fold them into their own lives. On clear nights the astronomer would place the brass spyglass on its tripod and point it toward those stubborn pinpricks of light. Children lined up and watched. The stars did not answer in words, but in the patient return of light. Each small catch felt like a reply. The town learned to read that reply not as a proclamation from above, but as a testimony. The echo has come back. It was, in its small way, a blessing. Echoes, they discovered, do not make legends alone. They make communities. They teach the patient arithmetic of care. Give enough that you remain, wait enough that you see, pass enough that someone else may pass. Between the river and the stars, the town found itself suspended, neither wholly local nor entirely remote, but very much connected by a web of small transmissions. The song changed timbre. It learned to speak in light as well as water. A child, cupping her hands at the cairn, lifted them and watched the waterfall. She thought of the spyglass, of a distant child reading a scrap of paper by some other river, of Prometheus leaning low to speak with a producer who wanted to turn songs into shows. She thought of the stone and the ember and the patient cadence of apprentice hands. Above her, stars drifted on. Between them, the town's echoes moved slow. Sure, and somehow enough. They learned, slowly, that echoes arrive in strange guises. An emissary from a distant academy arrived with a proposal to catalogue every letter, every whistle, every token. Their impulse was the same as the archivist's, to fix and preserve. The town listened politely and invited the emissary to sit at the key while they mended nets. She watched hands move, fold, knot, press, and in the dirt between her fingers she saw what even careful cataloguing could not hold: the tacit motion of attention, the unrecorded pause that let a child find a missing word. She left with her notebooks half full and half empty, and on the road she wrote a new line in the margin. Not everything that matters can be indexed. Some things must be attended. Not all visitors carried instruments of order. A troupe of players came, bent on staging the town's story as spectacle. They wanted Prometheus uprooted from small acts and placed on high pedestals. They wanted the cairn made into a stage prop. Prometheus, wherever memory hid him, was an easy figure to mythologize, and many towns had appetite for heroes. The players asked permission to rehearse by the river. The town agreed on condition that they also spend a week apprenticing in the boatyard and the mill. The actors learned to pass a plank in time, to steady a small boat in rough water, to fold a reed without snapping it. The first performance surprised them. It was clumsy, earnest, and oddly humble. The audience left with hands smelling of tar and clay and with, perhaps, a softer appetite for spectacle. Some echoes returned as tests. A distant publisher proposed a book that would distill the town's practices into a manual of civic virtue tight definitions, bulleted steps, checklists for compassion. The town's council argued into the long evening. Would such a thing spread their habit, or would it calcify it into instructions that missed the pause? Mela, whose hands remembered the exact knot that saved a child, said nothing at first and then spoke in the language she had always used, practical and blunt. If you make a recipe of mercy, she said, people will learn the steps and forget the reason. Better to teach the hands than to bind the book. The publisher left with samples of reed whistles and a new humility about what could be reduced to a list. Meanwhile, the astronomer taught the children to mark time in small increments, the slow drift of a star across a single night, the cadence of a comet returning in a longer life. It was a curriculum in patience. The children learned to map not only constellations but obligations, who had lent whom a cup, whose roof needed patching, which field had been left fallow for birds. Their maps were strange, half sky, half ledger, inked with both star charts and names. In this hybrid cartography the town discovered a new form of memory, one that honored both vast time and the immediate ledger of kindness. In the years that followed, some of the town's echoes took root in odd places. A school in a city 3 valleys over rang a bell for 5 silent minutes before every assembly, and a shipping guild adopted a clause that required captains to leave a berth open for any ferryman displaced by canal works. These were small laws, small habits, but they had weight. Once practiced, they bent behavior. Echoes deepened into institutions when they were tested by life and found useful, not preserved because they were quaint, but because they worked. Prometheus's shadow shifted to a producer who had once pressed him to package the song into spectacle, returned one autumn with a softer face. He had traveled and seen towns where listenings were sold and where embers were hoarded. He admitted, not in print but in a quiet voice by the cairn, that commerce had a hunger hard to restrain. I thought I could amplify what you had, he said. But I learned that amplification can drown the original signal. The town received his apology like a winter coat, useful, practical, not dramatic. He helped, thereafter, in modest ways, funding apprenticeships that required actual labor, underwriting a small observatory whose books would remain open to anyone. His money did not buy the habit, it only made room for its practice in places where time was thin. The box beneath the key filled and was emptied and filled again. Its contents, letters, whistles, scrap maps, were read aloud on wet Sundays and dry. Sometimes the town sent things back into the world with no expectation of return. Seeds for gardens, ropes, a clay cup or two. Other times they waited, and when replies came they were celebrated like harvests, in the quiet arithmetic of returns. Habits were justified. A reed whistle taught in a far harbor returned a year later with the note that a child had learned to wait. A map led to a negotiated canal that spared a marsh. These were not miracles so much as slow, stubborn proofs that patient practice accumulates effect. Toward the chapters, and the town built another small thing, neither instrument nor monument, but a practice, an afternoon once every month when anyone who wished could come to the quay and exchange a task for a token. Bring a patched net and take home a loaf, teach a knot, receive a whistle. No coin passed hands, only labor and instruction. It became a market of attention. Outsiders watched, baffled at first, then curious. Locals learned to steward skill and to remember that generosity must be mutual to be durable. On one of those afternoons a girl who had grown up cupping water climbed the cairn and unfolded a letter from a stranger. It was a short note from a schoolteacher far away. We tried waiting here. The bell woke something slow in us. She read the words aloud, and the key listened as if to a bell itself. The letter settled among the stones like seed. Under the spyglass the astronomer pointed once more to a faint trail, a pair of lights that seemed to mirror each other in slow sympathy. Those are echoes, he said softly, not voices from some other world, but reflections of our own practice. You made them. The children watched, learning to accept that their small acts might one day return in altered shapes, new laws, new songs, fresh kindnesses, and that even altered, they were part of the same thread. In the end, the chapter closes on an image. That is not dramatic so much as precise. A stack of letters tied with string, a reed whistle tucked beside a loaf, a spyglass pointing toward patient pinpricks of light. Prometheus' figure, name, habit remains part of the lore but no longer. Its axis, the town's music is braided now, river, ember, and star. Echoes travel. Sometimes they return as law, sometimes as lullabies, sometimes as commerce, sometimes as quiet apologies. The measure of success is not purity but persistence, the small arithmetic of giving enough that you remain, of waiting long enough to see, and of passing the ember again and again until it becomes a work shared by many hands. They kept the monthly exchange not as a spectacle but as a slow ritual of apprenticeship. Over time it reshaped the town's economy in small, stubborn ways. Favors accumulated like interest. Skills circulated until no single household could claim monopoly on any useful act. A mason taught a child how to bed a stone so frost would not pry it loose. That child taught a neighbor how to fold a sail without creasing the stitching. The neighbor, who had been shy with words, learned to sing a short work song that kept hands in time. These were modest trades of mercy, and their compound effect was unmistakable. Streets that once echoed with complaint now hummed with the soft confidence of people who could save one another from minor disaster. News of the market of attention traveled, as news does, through mouths and letters, and the occasional traveling merchant who found the idea useful in his own harbor. Some copied it badly, turning tokens into currency, turning instruction into workshop fees, but others replicated the core, exchanged labor for learning, not labor for spectacle. When an industrial town 3 valleys away tried an imitation, they kept the token system, but insisted on receipts. It failed. The experiment that endured were those that required presence. The hands that learned a knot could not be replaced by a scrap of paper. Meanwhile, the more delicate echoes threaded into unexpected places. A woman who had apprenticed under Mela walked for 3 days to a town that had lost its midwife. She stayed for a season, teaching how to name fears aloud and how to hand a cup in a way that held both warmth and silence. The receiving town, in turn, sent back a recipe for a bread that kept longer through damp autumns. These exchanges were not grand, they were the slow accretions of living craft. Each small return made the network tighter, until a map of such gifts looked less like trade routes and more like a skein of human attention. There were misfires. A well-meaning delegation once sent a crate of metal tools to a mountain village whose smiths worked only in shaped stone. The crate gathered rust in a storeroom because the tools were wrong for the rhythm of their hands. The town learned to send not only goods but instruction. The smith from the mountain came for a month, apprenticed in the town's boatyard, and returned with a new way to temper metal that fit his village's craft. The lesson was practical and blunt. Generosity without listening is merely clutter. Prometheus, though no longer central to daily life, still provided an axis for debate. Young people named projects after him Prometheus schools, Prometheus funds, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with irony. A college professor once came to study the town and published an essay titled Prometheus as Civic Metaphor, which the grocers read aloud and then folded into their accounts with little patience for long footnotes. The name served less as a shrine and more as a handle on which to hang argument. It let people disagree without collapsing into the kind of moral panic that once threatened to rip the town in two. One late autumn evening, the producer, the one who had tried to commodify the listenings, returned again, this time bearing neither apology nor contracts but a suitcase of quiet things, notebooks for apprentices, a modest grant for the Keys postbox, and a request to help write an oral history. He said he wanted to learn to tell the town's story without turning it into a product. Prometheus's defenders were skeptical, his critics were wary. The town, which had learned the grammar of patience, listened. They asked him to apprentice for 3 months in the boatyard and the bakery, to learn the motions that could not be reduced to lines on a sheet. He stayed, and his hands, clumsy at first, learned to fold dough, to tie a rope, to wait. In time, he helped compile a slim notebook that recorded not rules but example stories of mishap and repair, of awkward kindnesses that led to durable change. It was distributed freely in the market and never sold. Above all, the town learned that echoes can be generative or corrosive depending on attention. When they were mindful about what they sent out, tokens chosen for usefulness, letters written with patience, apprenticeships that required presence, the returns were rich and resilient. When they outsourced their practice to spectacle or sale, Echoes bent toward extraction. That knowledge hardened into a civic muscle, a daily question asked before any new plan was adopted: will this make us better at giving, or only better at appearing to give? As years threaded into one another, a new habit grew among the children. Each summer they climbed the cairn and left one small, deliberate object, something useful rather than purely symbolic. A needle, a length of cord, a hand-polished pebble, that could be used as a whetstone. The objects made the cairn less altar and more tool-chest. The pile of stones became a practical index of belonging. Visitors misread it at first, but then came to understand. The town's memory was not in monuments but in the items people needed to keep doing the work of care. On a clear night, with the spyglass set and a thin fog lying low over the water, the astronomer showed the children how to watch for echoes that were not made of paper but of action. A ship that altered its route to spare a shoal. A council that inserted a clause for mercy into a harsh law. A school that rang its bell for 5 minutes of silence. They drew lines on maps that stretched from their quay to distant harbors and annotated them with small notes: rope taught here, reed song carried there, bell copied in winter. The maps were humble and precise. They argued that influence need not be ostentatious to be durable. When the chapter finally slackened its pace toward an ending, it did not do so with a flourish. There was no miraculous moment of recognition, no single dramatic conversion. Instead, there was a long, accruing sense of possibility, letters tied with string, whistles tucked into pockets on journeys, spyglasses set to patient watch. Echoes had stretched the town outward without unraveling it. They had added thickness to the weave of lives rather than making holes in it. In the last scene, a simple one, as the town had come to prefer, a child stood on the cairn, the river's breath in her hair, and read aloud a letter from a place where a bell had begun to ring. She folded it and handed it to an elder, who tucked it into the little postbox by the quay. Then she climbed down, cupped the river, let the water run through her fingers, and walked back into the town where hands would keep learning to give. Above them the stars blinked and the spyglass winked. Somewhere, in a distant harbor, another child cupped a bowl and listened. The echoes, patient and small, went on. They began to mark anniversaries not of a single night, but of small returns. Each year a day was kept for reading letters aloud at dusk. Not a festival of speeches but a patient ritual where the quay listened to news and small gratitudes from elsewhere. People came with bread wrapped in cloth and sat with their knees touching, and the letters read like weather reports for the heart. A ferryman's son who had learned a knot, a school that kept 5 minutes of silence, a widow who had been given a loaf and a stool without questions. Those voices braided into the town's cadence, a steady chorus that reminded them their acts had weight beyond the lane. Institutions grew around practice rather than doctrine. The little observatory offered night lessons free to anyone who would. Apprentice an hour at the boatyard first. The market of attention formalized apprenticeships into seasons: 3 months mending nets, 3 months at the bakehouse, so that anyone wanting to learn might also be obliged to teach. Schools put aside an hour for quiet practice, where children learned to fold reeds and to hold a silence rather than to recite it. These were not rigid rules but scaffolds, frameworks that made the habit easier to pass on without petrifying it. Not every outward reach was gentle. A corporation from the city proposed a scheme to brand the town's method and sell certified listenings to places hungry for a quick fix. The council refused, not with rhetoric but with practice. They invited corporate emissaries to apprentice unpaid for a season, to earn the right to observe. Few stayed more than a week. The company's proposal dissolved into a paper trail and, eventually, a small donation to the quay's postbox, useful, if modestly so, because the donation underwrote apprenticeships rather than spectacle. As decades layered, new names lodged into the story and softened old quarrels. Maila's children taught their children to braid ropes in a way her father had never prescribed. Nera's knots were no longer secret but ordinary knowledge. Torin's grandchildren kept a ledger of favors, not to commodify them, but to remember them. Prometheus's name settled into the language the way an old tool settles into a toolbox, handy to point at but not the only thing worth using. Young people grew into the habit of sending echoes unbidden. A girl apprenticed in the distant cities sent back a parcel of seeds that thrived in damp lanes. A ferryman's apprentice took a whistle to the northern lakes and taught captains to time their calls so that crews could rest. A teacher translated the lullabies into a dialect that made the refrain easier to hum. Each small return changed the town in ways that could not be tallied by ledgers. New recipes, new knots, and extra minutes patience in a market quarrel. The spyglass remained a humble companion. Occasionally, on a clear night, a stranger would stand at its tripod and weep not from sorrow but from recognition. They would say, "I learned how to wait here," or "My town rang the bell because of a letter from your key." These moments of recognition were small and private, the true currency of echoes, proofs that habits did travel, that patience could be taught, that the ember if tended became useful heat and not a blaze of self-congratulation. The town also learned to forgive itself, where once a misapplied generosity had led to ruin. An ill-timed loan, an ill-placed canal. The memory of repair taught a different grammar. Admit the error, name the loss, rebuild in public. Public repair became a soft ritual. People came with hammers and bread. They mended more than roofs. They mended trust by showing the work of repair and inviting others to help. That openness altered the way echoes returned. When mistakes were acknowledged, replies came with corrections and help rather than judgment. In the quiet years, when the quay grew shaded with willows and new boats bore names of far places, a child found a letter tucked beneath a stone. It was old and faded, written by a stranger who had once stayed and taught a song. The child read it under the spyglass light, and the words simple and earnest felt like a bell. We tried the waiting. It made room for us. The child put the letter in the postbox and, of her own will, added a pebble to the cairn, a small, precise offering that said, "I remember. I practice." So the echoes threaded the town into a wider skein, not conquest, but conversation. They taught that influence need not be loud to be real, that practices move like slow tides, incremental, patient, and capable of reshaping shores. The ember that Prometheus once cupped was now not a fetish but a method. Hands taught hands, mouths taught mouths, small tools and tokens crossed borders. The town had become a place where generosity was learnable and, crucially, where learning required giving back. The chapter closes not with a single image but with a sequence of small ones, a child dropping a pebble into the cairn, a loaf passed without question, a whistle tucked into a pocket for a long journey, letters threaded with string and sent to quiet corners of the world. Above, the spyglass winked at indignant stars that did not care for human agendas, while below, the river hummed its old, steady song. Between sky and water, between ember and cup, the town kept practicing the arithmetic of care. Give enough that you remain, wait long enough to learn, pass on what helps. Echoes moved outward and returned, altering distant places not by decree but by the slow, stubborn work of habit. In the seasons that followed, the town discovered that echoes, once loosed, did not return in neat circles but in spirals. What they sent away rarely came back unchanged. It carried with it the fingerprints, the dialect, the hesitations of other hands. A reed whistle taught in one valley returned with holes bored in a different sequence, making a scale unfamiliar yet strangely kindred. A method for mending nets came back with knots altered better for heavier seas, though slower to tie. Instead of rejecting these mutations, the town began to treat them as gifts, variations as proof of life. Children were taught to look at such returns with curiosity rather than suspicion. In the little school by the river, they kept a cabinet of echoes, a shelf of altered objects, each tagged with a note about where it had wandered and what it had become. Some items were clumsy, even broken, but all were honored. To study them was to learn that generosity was not possession but release. The astronomer added a further lesson. He showed the children how light, too, bends and alters as it travels through dust or across vast gulfs. The stars you see, he told them, are never as they were. They are echoes distorted by distance. To demand purity is to misunderstand. The cosmos, the cabinet of echoes, became their terrestrial sky, objects scattered like constellations, imperfect yet still luminous. Not every echo was welcomed easily. A distant guild returned their tokens not with gratitude but with tariffs, demanding standardized measures of labor in exchange for the town's gifts. The council debated long. Should they comply in order to maintain the flow of exchange, or refuse and risk silence? At last Mela, whose hands still remembered the knot that had once saved a child, spoke again. If we bend our giving to fit a scale of profit, then we will learn to measure mercy in coin. Better silence than that. And so they refused. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It reminded them that refusal itself could be an echo. During that quiet, the producer who had apprenticed in the bakery began compiling a second book, not a manual this time, but a collection of testimonies. It was titled simply Echoes, The book contained no instructions, only voices, a ferryman describing how he learned to wait for stragglers, a child recalling the first whistle she carved, a midwife speaking of silence as the most potent medicine. The book circulated like contraband, copied by hand, passed along wrapped in cloth. Its strength lay in its refusal to be definitive. As years drew on, the cairn grew into something peculiar. It had ceased to be only stones or only tools, was now a patchwork archive of practical generosity. One could find a needle beneath a rock, a piece of cord knotted in 3 styles, a pebble worn smooth by countless pockets. Strangers came not to worship, but to borrow. They were asked only one thing, to leave behind something they themselves had altered by use. The cairn, like the cabinet of echoes, became less monument than living ledger. One dusk, as the river thickened with fog, a girl climbed the cairn holding a letter unlike the others. It bore no seal, no return, only a single line written in a hand no one recognized. Every star is an echo. Every echo is a beginning. The town did not know if it came from another place, another age, or from someone among them who wished to remain unseen. But the words fit into the rhythm of what they had already learned, so they were read aloud and folded into the cabinet. That night, the children pointed the spyglass at a dim cluster where no stars had been charted before, and they marked the sky with a new name, the spiral. The chapter's last image lingers on that children drawing constellations that did not exist the night before, adults listening as if to a far-off bell, and the river, tireless, carrying echoes downstream to places unseen. The story's pulse was no longer the figure of Prometheus alone, but the widening recognition that to live well was to live in resonance. Not purity, not permanence, but the courage to let what one gives be altered, and to welcome its return as something both foreign and familiar. They began to understand that echoes have momentum of their own. Once sent, they pick up strangers' accents, practical tweaks, and the honest mistakes of hands that do not belong to you. A whistle taught in one cove came back with extra holes, bored to play a different scale. A stitch learned from a ferryman returned sewn into a banner for a distant house. The town stopped policing purity and started cataloging variation. They called it learning by relay and education that trusted distance to transform rather than to corrupt. At the key the cabinet of echoes grew like a small atlas. Children thumbed through its labels not altered for tidal rigs, read, tuned for how wines, recipe, adapted for stone ovens, and learned that the map of usefulness is always irregular. The astronomer taught them to trace these changes as if they were stars. Draw a line from here to there, mark the mutation, and read what the alteration taught you. The sky and the shelf answered the same question in different tongues. What returns changed us, and how resistance persisted. A merchant guild tried to patent a method for communal kitchens. A far-off lord demanded standard weights before accepting a shipment of seed. The town met these with small, deliberate strategies. They refused to barter their core rituals for expedience, but they did not refuse negotiation altogether. When a lord insisted on measures, they offered instead mutual inspection and apprenticeship. Come learn how loaves are baked here. Make a loaf there until distrust thinned into an exchange of labor and then into understanding. The point was not to win every skirmish. It was to keep the grammar of giving intact. Prometheus, who had long since become more story than man, touched the town in the slight ways memory allows. Once, in a season of thin harvests, an old ferryman found an ember tucked under his oar. Coal no larger than a thumb, kept warm in cloth from a child who had learned the practice of passing. He did not carve it into a myth. He used it to light an apprentice's first kill brick. Such small consecrations mattered more than any statue could have. The name Prometheus was a handle now useful for argument, less useful for worship. The producer's conversion, too, remained quiet and particular. He did not mend the world in grand gestures. He supplied notebooks and funded a scholarship for apprentices who could not afford to miss seasons of work. Sometimes, at dusk, he would sit by the postbox and tie letters with clumsy fingers, learning the economy of patience. People accepted the help warily at first, then with the same practical generosity they asked of one another, show, don't, tell. His apology was not a single speech but a slow apprenticeship in the everyday. In time the network of echoes stitched itself into a loose federation. Towns that once traded grain and cord now traded rituals, a bell for waiting, a knot that saved a child, a lullaby with a held breath. These were not commodities in the old sense but practices that carried social weight. they were hard to invoice. They were, instead, measurable only by the small changes they produced: fewer panics, more hands ready to steady a ladder, a neighbor knocking before taking. On an evening when the fog lay low and the spyglass caught only gray light, the children drew a new map on the key, a web of lines connecting harbors and valleys, each intersection labeled with a borrowed thing. They added a note in a child's careful script: "We are not alone." The astronomer smiled and traced a spiral across the paper, pointing up where the sky met sea. "The spiral," he said, "because echoes rarely loop perfectly back. They curve, gather new voices, and arrive as altered music." The chapter closed not with a single grand lesson but with a ritual repeated and renewed: letters tied with string, stones placed into the cairn, whistles worn smooth in pockets, the spyglass set to watch slow lights. A child read aloud a note from a distant school: "We tried the waiting. It made room for us." They folded the page, tucked it into the postbox, and added a pebble to the cairn. The river ran on, indifferent and inexhaustible. Above, the stars kept their patient motion. Between water and sky, ember and whistle, the town had learned a modest arithmetic of effect: send with care, receive with curiosity, refuse what would, turn habit into hoarding, and teach by doing rather than by decree. Echoes moved outward and inward, changing shores as much by presence as by instruction. They thinned some things and deepened others. They taught a generation how to listen not only to the river but to the distant murmurings of a world that, when paid attention, returns what you give: strange, altered, and sometimes more useful than the original. When the last light folded, and children ran home with pockets full of small tools, the key felt less like a frontier and more like a seam. The town slept with the comfort that echoes, when stewarded, do more than reverberate. They weave. And somewhere beyond the bend, in some other harbor or hill valley, a child cupped a bowl of water and listened for the song that had begun here, soft, patient, and still spreading outward, one small act at a time. A season later, the town learned how fragile a string of echoes could be when pulled tight. A young ferryman's apprentice named Simma, who had spent summers apprenticing in 3 harbors and whose pockets always held a reed whistle and a folded letter, was hired for a voyage that promised both coin and the chance to carry the town's practices farther than a single coast. She went because she loved the way lessons traveled in her hands. She went because the key had taught her that a leaving was another form of passing. Before she sailed, the whole town gathered not to bless her but to remind her: take bread that keeps, leave a token that helps, and above all, apprentice where you arrive. Her ship threaded estuaries and crossed a sea that liked to invent new voices. In port after port, Simma apprenticed in small trades, mending a rope in a fishing village 3 islands away, teaching a child to fold a cup in a market that smelled of spice, trading a reed whistle for a bolt of cloth. Some places took the habit. As the town would have hoped, they practiced, altered, and sent back something like gratitude. Others were less gentle. In a city of brass and contracts, a reed whistle was priced and copied into cheap toys. The toy whistles lost the breaths, patient pause, and became shrill things children tired of fast. Simma carried both kinds of returns in her chest, the bright and the ragged. On the return voyage a storm gathered like a closed fist. The captain, unfamiliar with the small signals Simma had learned for timing a line, cursed the wind where her apprentice hands knew what to do. It was an urgent lesson. Habit, taught poorly, is brittle. Habit, practiced in the moment and shared by muscle, can save a life. When a rogue rope snapped and a sailor was nearly swept into the swell, it was Simonese braced, breath held in the taut way of the key, who looped a saving knot and handed the man back to the deck. The captain, who had measured the voyage in profit and timetables, watched hands that had learned to give and remain. He made no speeches, but that night he left coin in the ship's common pot with a different look in his eyes. Simma returned home with a pack full of useful scraps: a new pattern for a sail that resisted tear, a crock of a fermenting bread from an island that kept longer through humidity, and a stack of receipts for toy whistles sold in a market 3 days' run. She unrolled them all at the key, not to tally loss and gain but to sort what could be taught and what should be refused. The town argued heatedly at first about whether every outward echo deserved welcome. They had learned, painfully, that openness required discernment. Generosity without care can be co-opted. Generosity with eyes open can be planted and pruned out. Of such arguments came a practice that was small and strict. Any visitor who taught here must also learn. If you wanted to be given a reed and a knot, you needed to spend a season in the boatyard or the bakehouse. If you sought to copy the lullaby or the bell, you were invited to apprentice with a midwife or a ferryman. It was not exclusionary as much as preservational. It was a slow firewall against conversion into commodity. People grumbled those with impatience enough to prize speed over depth, but the rule preserved a rhythm, presence before export. Simma herself took on the work of stewarding incoming echoes. She taught newcomers to test their returns. Will this stitch hold in a storm? Will this recipe feed many in lean weather? Her ledger was not of receipts but of questions. Where did this token go? And how did it return? She wrote little marginalia practical notes like a midwife's shorthand so that apprentices would know how to look. In that way the town's outward voice grew less like a trade and more like a craft, deliberate, attuned, and accountable. Years folded on. Some echoes traveled farther than anyone expected. One reed whistle taught at a remote lighthouse returned with a new cadence that became a distress call in a channel where fog was frequent. Another echo returned as a law. Charter in a port city that required captains to maintain a berth for small boats during certain months. Not all returns were perfect or immediate. Many took decades. But the town's patient arithmetic accepted that influence measured in time. Rather than headlines. At the close of that season the key staged its quiet ritual once more. Simma climbed the cairn with a loaf from the island and the patched sail tucked under her arm. Children clustered at her feet. Elders watched with the calm of people who had learned how to hold waiting in their bones. She read aloud a letter from a place where a bell had begun to ring softly 5 minutes before every council meeting, and the crowd, as if relaxing a long muscle, grew still. The spyglass turned toward indifferent stars. Down below the river moved on, carrying small, patient sounds. Between sea and stone, ember and whistle, the town rehearsed again what it had learned to be, a place that sends carefully, receives curiously, and teaches generously, but always with a hand ready to steady the next passerby who might stumble in the dark. Where once the key's correspondence had been curiosities and polite gratitude, it became a living curriculum. Apprentices carried lists of questions when they left, and returned with answers that were never simple, only useful. The town's map of echoes thickened into routes with names: the breadway that brought long-keeping loaves, the knot line where sailors traded joins that would not slip, the lullaby lane where teachers swapped held-breath refrains for restless children. These were not merely conveniences. They were a polity of practice, a republic run by hands. Not all who arrived wanted to learn for the right reasons. A syndicate of merchants slick in collars and language came bearing promises of scale. Teach the bell to every town in the region and reap the benefit. Their charts were glossy, their figures seductive. They imagined a world quantified by measures of compassion. They could not see that the town's value was not in replicable metrics but in slow reciprocity. The council met them politely, and the council's polite face hid a muscle of stubbornness. Mela, who had little use for speeches, invited two of the merchants to the bakehouse. She gave them dough to mine through the night, and told them to wake only when the oven cried. They woke with blisters and humility and left with a small loaf and an even smaller idea of how quickly practice resisted profit. Crisis came in a form almost banal, a fever that took the town's elders through one long winter. It began in the mills, drifted through the markets, and made the quiet places of the quay loud with coughs and whirring. The old rhythms apprenticeships, the market of attention, the postbox did not dissolve, they deepened. People who could, carried wood and water, those whose hands were steady tended fires and brewed bitters. Children delivered reed whistles and folded lists into pockets to be read aloud at the bedside. The habit of giving became the hospital's architecture. Bowls left on thresholds, beds rotated so no house was emptied of its caretakers, recipes shared for strengthening broths. The fever scoured some assumptions clean. Spectacle mattered less than steadiness, reputation mattered less than presence. Out of the danger grew a different sort of export. A neighboring valley, which had once hoarded its harvest in lean seasons, asked to apprentice for a year. They came not to copy a manual but to learn the tissue of small acts that kept people alive in ordinary times and emergencies alike. Apprentices from the valley slept in the town's spare rooms, swept its floors, learned its knots, and in return taught a barter ledger that allowed mutually assured help across long winters. The arrangement was modest and resilient. It stitched lives so that the next time the fever marched, fewer households stood alone. Simma watched these developments and, at times, despaired softly less at the failures than at the work that never finished. She had nights when the postbox seemed too heavy with expectation, when a letter's plea felt like a debt. But then a child would arrive with a pebble and a new song learned on a distant key, and her hands would relax. She learned to accept that stewardship was not stewardship of an ember but stewardship of a habit. Its maintenance required patience, not triumph. Years layered into one another and made room for new voices. A woman named Lida, quick with a laugh and quicker with a mend, became Simma's apprentice and then her peer. Lida had an appetite for futures. She proposed a small schoolroom where children might practice the town's rhythms not as chores, but as play. The school was simple: knots under the window, a kettle that always had spare tea, a shelf for the cabinet of echoes. Children learned maps of both sky and seam. They traced constellations and then traced the routes a whistle had taken to arrive there. The pedagogy was playful and fierce at once, teaching that delight and discipline could be the same muscle. Beyond the key, the network deepened in unexpected ways. A captain who had once scoffed at reed whistles donated a ledger to record names of those who could not repay a favor, names to be remembered, not to be collected on a tally. A composer from a mountain town sent a tune that fitted a lullaby the town had taught her. She wrote it down in a script that made it look older than it was, and the tune traveled back and forth like a bird with new plumage. These exchanges accumulated into a culture that measured itself less by what it owned and more by what it could hand along without losing warmth. And yet the world beyond the network's soft perimeter pressed. Governors in distant cities wanted to formalize the market of attention into a public contract. Volunteers, yes, but recorded, certified, and taxed. The proposal came like a polite tide. The town deliberated, as it always did, by doing. They invited representatives to apprentice in the very season that would test any such law, the barley harvest, when hands could not be spared for paper. The representatives returned with ink on their sleeves and grains in their pockets. Some came to understand, others to take paper back to their offices and draft columns that made no sense outside the practice that birthed them. It was a reminder: laws could scaffold habit but could not replace the slow muscle that made care itself. New generations grew up less impressed by any single name. Prometheus remained a word one used to point, a handle rather than a gospel. Children learned the refrain as they learned the alphabet: give enough that you remain. Wait enough that you see, pass what helps. They taught their own games around the refrain. One involved cupping water until a pebble sank, another involved passing a loaf with eyes closed and learning the weight of trust. Ritual and play became indistinguishable, each reinforcing the other. Toward the chapter's close, a small, precise moment arrived. An envoy from a port 2 days sailing, an envoy who had once been a child on the quay, returned not with schemes, but with a broken reed whistle and a single line of a letter. We kept the waiting. The bell rings here now. The town celebrated in the modest way it had learned: no speeches, only work. Someone mended the whistle, someone else baked a loaf, and a dozen hands set a new stone into the cairn. The spyglass turned up at dusk and, for once, seemed to find a new pinprick of light steady enough to mark. The echo had come back, altered but true, and so the pattern persisted. The town did not become famed, nor did it collapse into obscurity. It held its small practices like a net that could catch what mattered: kindness, skill, patience. Its echoes continued outward, sometimes as laws, sometimes as songs, sometimes as a single useful knot, and returned with ripples that taught and changed. The work remained unglamorous: mending, teaching, listening, refusing what hollowed the practice. Yet it was enough. In the dark between tides, children cupped their hands, the cairn grew, letters were tied, and the stars spun on their slow, indifferent music, answering back to a human chorus that had learned, finally, how to send with care and to receive with curiosity. The years folded quietly into one another like pages turned by a steady hand. Simma grew older in the way people do who spend themselves on care. Her back kept the memory of ropes, her palms the fine scars of dough and ore. Lida's school became a place where play and practice braided. Its children learned to speak of knots and lullabies with the same casual fluency as numbers and letters. Apprenticeships lengthened and shortened with need. Some seasons demanded long hands for repair, Others required only the light touch of a lesson taught and then repeated, but the town's curriculum never lost its basic rule: show me, don't tell me. New strains of temptation arrived, subtle and patient. Merchants offering efficiency partnerships sent emissaries with polite smiles and glossy plans, ways to scale kindness into products, to certify compassion into merchantable franchises. The town received these callers as it had begun to receive all echoes, with the waiting hour of apprenticeship. Those who could not bear the quiet of the bakehouse or the scrape of the boatyard found themselves unenthused. Those who stayed learned quickly that the muscle of attention is built in boredom and repetition, not by contracts. A few deals were struck, small, useful improvements in dock safety that cost nothing of the town's habits, but the larger temptations found the keys. Patience, a poor market. Sometimes the echoes returned as plain miracles of usefulness. A ledger once offered in jest a list of favors handwritten by Torrance grandson became a toolbox for mutual aid in a flood 3 valleys over. Neighbors came with ladders and returned with songs. A teacher who had apprenticed for a season taught a village on a cliff how to time a bell to wake a watch that kept avalanche from breaking a road. These were small triumphs, not monuments, and they multiplied quietly. A stitch learned here saved a roof there. A lullaby taught in a school eased the cries of an orphan in another town. Not all returns were so tidy. An academic wrote a paper that misread the market of attention as an emergent governance model and suggested it be codified into regional ordinance. At a council meeting, ink-stained hands debated whether law could ever do the job soft hands did. Male, older now, her hair threaded with white but her fingers still exact, stood and said, as she had often said, "You cannot legislate the pause." Her words landed with the residue of lived practice. The council sent the paper back with a polite rejection and a small addendum. Before any policy takes effect, it must pass the apprenticeship hearth. The region laughed at first. Later, when a neighboring town applied the test, the laughter turned to a slow, grudging respect. In the quiet hours, people found new ways to reckon with loss. Children who had been taught to cup water now learned to cup grief. When the fever took elders and left gaps that no ledger could fill, the town did what it always did. Neighbors sat, hands busy with mending, while words came slowly and the practical work of life continued. They did not pretend absence away. Instead, they made room for it. Beds stayed empty for a night or two as stories were told aloud. Bowls were left on doorsteps, and apprentices took over tasks with the clumsy compassion of those still learning. Simma's role shifted further from voyager to steward. She kept a careful list of routes and returns, a notebook that read less like an account book and more like a map of human attention. Who had taught what where, which tokens had become useful, which had been commodified and lost their heart. She taught the children to read that map as they read the star-seeing pattern without mistaking it for destiny. In one entry she wrote, "Measure by return, not by sending." The proof is in the way hands change. That sentence became a teaching line in Lita's school. As another autumn creased the sky, the town received a letter unlike most. It was short, the handwriting shaky, and the paper bore the salt of many roads. It came from a harbor 3 coasts away, where a small bell had been rung for 5 patient minutes before every council meeting. The letter read, "We kept the waiting. Our harbor did not become soft, it became safer." They enclosed a photograph faded of a quay where men and women stood in a circle, hands linked, looking less like voters and more like neighbors. The town read the photograph aloud beside the postbox, the image passing from hand to hand until even the children could tell the story by heart. On the quay that evening the spyglass was set, as always, though tonight its brass seemed to gleam with a quiet approval. Children clustered round, apprentices set knots without being asked, and an old ferryman hummed a tune that had picked up a foreign cadence somewhere out at sea. The cairn looked less like a monument and more like a communal kit: pebbles, nails, whistles, a patch of sailcloth. A child added a small, chipped spoon and stepped back to watch the way elders adjusted it among the stones. The spoon found its place like any other useful thing. The chapter's end does not offer an ending so much as a pause, one of the many the town had learned to practice. The key held its breath and then returned to its work. Letters were tied. A whistle was passed from hand to hand, and the riverside along its course. Echoes kept going outward and returning altered. Some were used, some were abandoned, and some became the seed for something new. Between sky and water, ember and cup, the town stayed at its patient, ordinary work, sending carefully, receiving curiously, and teaching always by the hands that do. The next spring brought a subtle shift in rhythm. The key, long accustomed to the quiet pulse of daily labor, felt an added resonance, as if the echoes themselves had multiplied unseen. A messenger arrived one dawn, bearing a parcel wrapped in reed fibers, tied not with string but with a ribbon of braided light, something the children insisted was spun from dawn itself. Inside was a small, intricate device, a miniature bell with a note that read, "For listening, not for ringing." Curious hands took it apart and studied its curves, turning it over like a puzzle that had learned patience. Mela and Lita watched silently, letting the children explore. When the smallest apprentice accidentally tapped it, a soft hum floated out, a sound that seemed to carry the voices of many towns at once. It was neither melody nor warning. It was something in between, the resonance of attention itself. Simma, who had learned to hear the quiet in the gaps of sound, whispered that it was exactly what the town had been building all along, a bridge between intention and effect, between giving and understanding. Visitors began arriving from further away than ever before. They were not merchants, scholars, or officials. They were seekers, travelers who had caught wind of the town through stories, through letters, through a single echo that reached them in some lonely corner of the world. Some came to learn the ways of waiting, others to teach a song, a stitch, a method of noticing. The key welcomed them all with its habitual generosity, offering work, instruction, and the quiet ritual of observation. The newcomers learned quickly that the town's skill was not in technique alone, but in the deliberate, patient attention paid to every small act. Amid these arrivals, Prometheus's name, once a tale, whispered to explain inspiration and fire, took on a softer, subtler role. Children repeated it like a refrain, not to summon heroism but to mark the idea of curiosity, of courage in the service of care. Prometheus was remembered in gestures, a hand steadying another's, a loaf passed without question, a knot tied to hold a fragile sail or a fragile heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the key gold, Simma stood at the edge of the water, holding the small bell. She listened as the hum mingled with the river's song and the distant calls of returning birds. She thought of the letters, the apprentices, the ebbing fevers and rising tides of generosity. And she realized that the town, in its quiet, persistent work, had become less a place than a living echo itself, an echo that stretched outward, shaped by care, and returned altered, richer, alive. And so the key continued, as it had for years, as it would for years to come, a space where waiting was taught as a skill, where small acts were measured not by grandeur but by effect, and where every echo carried a lesson in patience, attention, and the subtle, unglamorous magic of ordinary kindness. The town's pattern of life deepened into a quiet symphony. Each day, as apprentices learned to braid rope or fold letters, the river seemed to respond in kind, tracing silver threads across its surface that mirrored the movements of hands. Birds lingered longer on the key's posts, as if they too had learned the rhythm of attention. Even the wind seemed gentler, shifting only to carry a note from one window to the next, never disturbing, always guiding. A new generation of apprentices arrived, some from valleys far beyond any map the town kept. They came with questions that were not yet formed, with curiosity and shaped by expectation. Simma, now older, guided them patiently. Here, we measure care not by the outcome, but by the attention it demands. Each act is a bridge, each gesture a line connecting one life to another. Children repeated her words in games, in songs, in knots, embedding them into muscle and habit rather than memory alone. The small bell, the one that hummed when tapped, became a focus of wonder. Each time someone struck it, the sound carried across the quay and into the river, a ripple that reached distant windows and shores. Travelers, who had left years before, returned to find the bell waiting, its hum a signal that the network of attention they had once glimpsed was alive, continuous, expanding. Some brought gifts, maps of constellations unfamiliar to the town, new songs, or techniques of mending that transformed simple cloth into resilient sails. Others brought nothing but their presence, and even that was received as an offering. Simma noticed a subtle change. The echoes began to arrive in patterns more complex than before. Letters arrived not only with practical advice but with questions, small challenges meant to test the town's patience and adaptability. One letter contained a riddle about knots and tides. Another asked how to teach waiting without losing curiosity. These were puzzles meant not to frustrate but to deepen understanding. to ensure that the skill of attention continued to grow. Each response required thought, deliberation, and care. Each reply reinforced the town's principle that learning is an act of giving, and giving is itself a form of learning. The fever that had once threatened the town became a distant memory, yet its lesson lingered. In the quiet evenings, apprentices and children would sit by the river and whisper the names of those who had been lost, honoring them by practicing the care they had left behind. Bowls of water were left on doorsteps for anyone in need. Small fires were tended in hearths where strangers might rest. Every action became a note in the ongoing music of the town, an echo carried forward in the lives of those who participated. And then, one clear night, Simma and Lita watched as a shooting star arched across the sky. Children pointed, and the bell hummed in response, though no hand touched it. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire town, its apprentices, its elders, its visitors, even those far away, were bound together in a single, humming pattern of care. Simma whispered to Lita, "This is why we wait, why we teach, why we pass. What matters along. The echo never ends, it only grows." The chapter closed not with a conclusion but with continuity. The key continued to hum, the river continued to sing, and the network of attention stretched ever outward, subtle but persistent. Letters, knots, songs, and small acts of care became the true infrastructure of the town, a living, breathing testament to the quiet power of ordinary patience. In the echoes between stars, the town's work persisted, sending, receiving, and transforming every gesture into the enduring music of connection. As the seasons turned, the town's network of care deepened into a rhythm that seemed almost independent of its people. The river carried news, the wind carried whispers, and the bell hummed across distances no one could measure. Apprentices now moved with an ease that made each gesture purposeful yet unforced. Even the smallest child knew how to pause, watch, and act in ways that honored the work of those before them. Simma, older and steadier, walked the quay each morning, noting the subtle signs of life. A knot tied with extra care, a loaf of bread, shared with someone who had forgotten to ask, the way letters were folded so that each recipient could read them without strain. She realized that the town had become a living map of attention and generosity, each person a thread in a tapestry too large for any single eye to see. Visitors continued to arrive, not out of necessity but curiosity and admiration. They brought questions and gifts, yes, but more importantly, they carried the echoes back to their own lands. A teacher who had learned the patient pause returned to a distant school, teaching children to listen as much as to speak. A ferryman carried the practice of noticing subtle tides to another harbor, saving lives without ever being recognized. The echoes, like the river, like the bell, like the hum of the wine, continued outward, unpredictable yet deliberate. One twilight, as the sky flushed violet and gold, Simma stood by the bell with Lita. Together, they listened as it resonated. Softly, a note both old and new. "Do you hear it?" Lita asked. "It's telling us the story of everyone who has touched it." Simma nodded. "And everyone who ever will. Every act, every pause, every care is a part of it." The echo never stops. The apprentices gathered around, young faces tilted toward the river and the horizon beyond. They understood, even without words, that their hands were conduits of this invisible music. A rope tied, a letter sent, a song taught, all carried weight beyond measure, each a bridge connecting lives across space and time. And so, the town endured, not through monuments, laws, or fame, but through quiet, persistent attention. Every echo mattered, every gesture of care multiplied in ways no one could fully track. The river whispered its approval, the stars glimmered in response, and the bell hummed, as if laughing softly at its own simplicity. The network of kindness stretched outward, endless, carrying the subtle magic of ordinary lives devoted to patience, listening, and care. In the distance, the stars blinked and spoke in patterns that mirrored the town below. And somewhere in that vastness, Prometheus smiled, not for glory, but for the enduring fire of attention, curiosity, and the quiet courage to act with care. Beyond the quay, the world seemed to bend toward the town's quiet rhythm. Letters arrived from unknown corners, each carrying fragments of thought, small acts of kindness, or questions that demanded reflection rather than immediate answers. Each apprentice learned to read these arrivals not as instructions, but as invitations to notice, to respond, to let their hands and hearts shape the work of care. Simma walked among them, teaching subtly. "Do not hurry," she said, "for The river does not rush, and the stars do not argue over their place. Attention is the current, patience is the tide. The children and apprentices repeated these words as they worked, their actions infused with the echo of experience, their movements carrying the weight of deliberate thought. One evening, the sky was aflame with a constellation no one had named, and the bell hummed without human touch. Its resonance stretched across the quay, reaching the distant hills and forests, where travelers paused mid-step to listen. Some took notes, some whispered prayers, some simply smiled, sensing a connection that needed no explanation. The town had become a source of unspoken guidance, a lighthouse not for ships alone, but for hearts seeking the steady beat of attentive care. In the quiet of her room, Simma wrote a final note in her worn notebook. The work of care is endless. Every letter sent, every knot tied, every ear that listens is a thread in a fabric that will outlast us all. Do not measure by fame or recognition, measure by effect, by return, by the subtle hum that echoes long after your hands are still. That night, the apprentices gathered by the river, each holding a small token, a spoon, a rope, a letter, a song, and together they released them into the current. The river carried these gifts onward, twisting and turning, touching unknown lives, carrying the town's quiet music into places unseen. The stars above blinked in tandem, and the town settled into its enduring rhythm. Work, attention, kindness, and the patient hum of echoes became the true monument of the place, an eternal testament to what ordinary hands and attentive hearts could achieve together. And somewhere, beyond the horizon and across the silent night, the echoes continued their journey, forever weaving connection, curiosity, and care across the world. Chapter 11 closes fully here, leaving the river, the bell, and the stars as witnesses to the ongoing, unending work of attention and kindness.